Ruth Marwood had been in the house for 17 years, long enough to memorize the sound of its silences. It was a quiet kind of wealth, old and airless, the kind that smelled like lavender wax and forgotten silver. The marble floors never creaked, the chandeliers never flickered, and nothing in the house was ever out of place, except Ruth herself. She moved through the rooms like breath. Cleaning, folding, fetching. The Garricks liked things done a certain way. Coat collars folded left over right, shoes aligned toe first on the mat, milk steamed to exactly 65 degrees. Ruth had learned it all. Not once in 17 years had Penelope Garrick thanked her for remembering. "You're reliable," she'd said once. Not kindly. Not unkindly either. Just as if she were assessing a washing machine. Ruth slept in a narrow room under the attic eaves, barely wider than the bed itself. The window, painted shut long ago, looked out over the rooftops, where satellite dishes glinted like frost in the mornings. That window was her only witness. At night, when the family had retired and the house had settled into itself, Ruth would lift the floorboard beside her bed, pull out a battered laptop wrapped in an old tea towel, and write. She wrote in silence, the kind that crackled. She wrote about everything they never saw. About her mother's back-breaking years scrubbing floors in Peckham. About the first time someone asked if she was the help in a shop she'd worked at for 2 years. About the day she'd learned to disappear so well that even the woman she served forgot she was in the room. She wrote in a language that didn't apologize. She didn't write to be discovered. She wrote because it was the only place she could exist without restraint. Because no one interrupted her there. On the page, she had skin that bruised and healed. A voice that wasn't an echo. A name that was hers. The Garricks often forgot her name. At parties, Ruth poured champagne while Penelope's friends discussed their book clubs and intellectual retreats. No one looked at her. No one ever asked, "And what do you read?" Sometimes, in the quietest moments, she'd feel a sting behind her ribs. Not anger, just the tired ache of being walked through like furniture. Still, she did her work. She polished their marble until it gleamed. She pressed Penelope's dresses until they hung like stiff ghosts in the wardrobe. She ironed silence into every corner of the house. And when it was all done, when the wine glasses were rinsed, the guest towels refolded, and the footsteps above had stilled, Ruth opened her laptop and returned to her other life. The one where her hands were not for scrubbing, but for shaping. The one where people listened. The one where she wrote with the urgency of someone trying to breathe through paper. And each night, she closed the screen gently, as if sealing a wound, and whispered to herself the last line she'd written. "They see the skin, not the paper it's made of." Earlier that week, she'd been in the sitting room, rearranging the books Penelope liked to pretend she'd read. The youngest child, Felix, had wandered in barefoot, clutching a sandwich in one hand and a crayon in the other. "Ruth," he said, chewing, "do you live here forever?" She turned, not startled. Felix was 6, too young to know the art of invisibility yet. "Not forever, no." "Why not?" She paused, balancing a copy of The Secret History against the weight of a neglected hardback about wine. "Because nothing stays in the same place forever." Felix considered that, biting into his sandwich. He looked at her then, really looked, with those wide, unbothered eyes children have before the world hands them categories. "You smell like oranges," he said. Ruth smiled, just faintly. "That's the Polish." He seemed satisfied. "You should have a room with a big bed. Like Mummy's. Yours is too small." She didn't reply. What would be the point? Felix wandered off. By the next morning, he wouldn't remember the conversation, but she would. It was the only time in years someone in that house had spoken to her like she existed. It was a Wednesday morning when Ruth first heard Penelope Garrick mention the manuscript competition. She was setting out grapefruit halves on the breakfast table, while Penelope tapped away at her phone with a kind of aggressive elegance. "Anonymous submissions," she said aloud. "God help us. I suppose everyone with a tragic past will crawl out of the woodwork now." Ruth kept her eyes on the silver spoons. "But Sterling's doing it." Authentic voices from unheard corners. Penelope sipped her coffee, then added, Julian says it's meant to sound inclusive. Everyone's trying to be relevant. The housekeeper, Myra, said something in response, a soft chuckle or maybe just air. Ruth didn't move. That evening, when the house was quiet again, Ruth wrote without hesitation. She gathered chapters she had started over the years, stitched them together, bled them clean. She changed names but not events. Her sister's overdose. The long commute in winter. The time she cried in a walk-in pantry because no one would grant her a moment to grieve. She titled it Paper Skin and signed it with nothing. No pseudonym, no initials. Just the story. At the library 2 streets over, she logged in to the free terminal. A shaking finger hovered before she clicked Submit. No one would read it. She was certain. But someone did. 2 weeks later, Penelope was hosting one of her tastelessly lush dinner parties. The wine was French and unnecessarily expensive. The guests, all publishing people or their perfumed spouses, sat in a half-circle by the fireplace. Julian Chandler, the editor-in-residence, held up a printed manuscript like it was a holy object. This one, he said. This is the one. Oh yes, Penelope said, swirling her glass. Paper Skin, isn't it? God, it's absolutely tragic. Beautiful, but brutal. Ruth stood a few feet behind them, a linen napkin in hand, her spine straight. They didn't glance back. Of course they didn't. Julian leaned forward. We don't know who wrote it. No name, no history. Just this voice, clean, cutting, stripped bare. It's written by someone who suffered, another guest murmured. You can feel it. They talked about the author like a ghost they all wanted to believe in. And Ruth, still standing there, knew exactly how ghosts felt. She left the napkins folded perfectly. She moved through the rest of the evening as usual, present but untouched, like good furniture. But later, in her attic room, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. They had read her, loved her, without knowing. She was afraid, and alive. The next morning, Penelope passed her in the hall and said, The glasses from last night are still streaked, Ruth. Try not to rush next time. Ruth nodded, lowered her eyes. She had already begun writing the next chapter. Not for them. For herself. The letter came in a white envelope with gold trimming. Ruth found it tucked between the morning papers and a grocery receipt on the hallway table. She opened it slowly, deliberately, like peeling away old wallpaper. The Sterling Prize was pleased to inform the anonymous author of Paper Skin that their manuscript had been selected as the winner for the inaugural Unheard Voices Prize. A modest advance. A guaranteed publication. An exclusive gala, where the work would be celebrated, even if the author remained unnamed. Ruth stared at the page so long she forgot to breathe. That night, she polished the cutlery like always. She ironed Penelope's silk dress for the upcoming event and checked for lint between the shoulders. She made coffee exactly how Julian Chandler liked it whenever he visited. Double espresso, no sugar. She did it all without trembling. But inside, something had split open. Not pride. Not quite joy. Just the strange, aching certainty that she had cracked through something enormous and invisible and cold. The night of the gala arrived. The Garrick townhouse had been transformed. Candles flickered in tall glass columns. A harpist played in the drawing room, and waiters in black passed canapes on silver trays Ruth had polished that morning. The house was alive in a way it never was for her. Guests floated through the rooms with glasses of Prosecco and educated laughter. Julian Chandler stood near the fireplace, holding court. Penelope wore a wine-colored gown, her hair swept back to reveal diamond earrings. She was radiant, practiced, powerful. Ruth waited until the speeches were almost done. Julian cleared his throat and held up a wine glass. Tonight, we celebrate the raw, staggering brilliance of Paper Skin, a manuscript that cracked us open and stitched us back together. The author has chosen to remain anonymous, and maybe that's part of its magic. That such a voice could rise from silence and speak with such. Ruth stepped forward. She wasn't wearing a gown, just a black dress, clean and pressed, and her old white trainers. She didn't look like someone anyone in that room would have invited. But she kept walking until she was standing beside Julian. A flicker of discomfort passed through the room like a breeze. "I wrote Paper Skin," she said, her voice even and low. "My name is Ruth Marwood." There was a beat of silence too heavy to carry. Then, laughter. From someone near the back. Sharp, nervous. Julian turned to her, smile frozen. "I'm sorry." Ruth looked him in the eye. "I wrote it. Every word." Penelope stepped forward, face stiff. "Ruth, what are you doing?" "I'm telling the truth." Julian cleared his throat. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't." Penelope blinked slowly. "You're tired. It's been a long day. Maybe you've misunderstood what this event is." "I haven't." Ruth pulled a folder from her bag. "These are the handwritten drafts. This is the flash drive with the original file, same title, same structure, dated 6 months ago. And here," she held up her phone, "is a voice memo of me reading chapter 3. Time-stamped. Before you read it." Julian took a step back, hands raised slightly, like he was calming a wild thing. "Ruth, this is very serious. It's a published manuscript now. We need to be careful about claims." "I'm not making a claim," she said softly. "I'm correcting a misconception." The silence that followed was different this time. No longer awkward. Just raw. "Wait," someone whispered. "She's the housekeeper, isn't she?" "No, no," said another. "She cleans. I've seen her before. She doesn't even have—" "What? An agent? How would she? Does she even have an education?" And Penelope, still frozen in place, said it quietly but clearly. "Ruth, why would you embarrass yourself like this?" It was a knife wrapped in a napkin. Ruth didn't flinch. She looked around the room, at the people who had praised her pain, now recoiling from its source. "They loved my words," she said, voice steady, "until they learned whose mouth they came from." One of the junior editors, a young woman with nervous eyes, stepped forward. If what she's saying is true, and the documents check out, then she's the author. It doesn't matter where she comes from." Penelope's laugh was brittle. "Oh please, don't be naive." Julian didn't speak. He looked down at the folder in his hands, and then up at Ruth, as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to coexist. Ruth looked around once more. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was finished. "I didn't write Paper Skin to impress anyone," she said. "I wrote it to stay alive." And with that, she turned and walked out. Past the tray of flutes. Past the woman in pearls who looked away. Past Penelope, who still stood rooted in the center of her perfect house, unable to understand how someone like Ruth could write something she couldn't even feel. Upstairs, in her attic room, Ruth sat on her bed. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She opened her laptop, where a new file sat blinking at the top of the screen. Title: Chapter 1. After the applause. She began typing, calmly, without pause. The sound of her fingers on the keys was soft, like rain. The next morning, the house was quieter than usual. Ruth woke early, as always, but not because of the schedule. She had barely slept. The air in her attic room felt thinner now, as if it no longer needed to carry the weight of the person she'd been forced to be. Outside her small window, the rooftops of London looked the same. But something in her had shifted. She packed slowly. A single suitcase. A pair of worn shoes. 2 dresses. Her charger. The black notebook she'd filled with everything she couldn't say. And the laptop, warm in her hands like a small animal she had raised in secret. The hallway smelled of jasmine and expensive silence. She walked past the room she had once dusted with care, the study with the unread books, the dining room where laughter had been currency, and the drawing room with the grand piano no one ever played. Penelope Garrick didn't come downstairs. She had sent Myra, the housekeeper, to pass along a message instead. You may stay until the end of the week, if you wish. But it's probably best for everyone if things wrap up sooner. Ruth had only nodded. What else could she do? There would be no apology. Not from Penelope, not from Julian, not from any of the people who had sipped wine and swallowed her story whole, then gagged when they learned whose mouth it came from. She walked into the kitchen, the place she knew best. The kettle was still warm from Myra's morning tea. Ruth reached into the cupboard, pulled out a white envelope, and placed it on the counter. Inside was her key, her work schedule annotated in neat handwriting, and a simple note. I won't be serving dinner tonight. I'm writing the next chapter. Ruth. Then she walked out the front door of the house she had cleaned, cared for, and vanished inside of, for nearly 2 decades. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. She took the bus. Not a taxi, not a car with tinted windows. Just the 147 to Camden, where a friend had offered her a spare room and a desk by the window. It was a tiny space, but the light poured in like something holy. By evening, her inbox had begun to swell. Interview requests. Praise. A cautious email from Julian Chandler. I'd appreciate a conversation, when you're ready. She didn't reply. That night, Ruth sat by the window in her new room, wrapped in a shawl, watching the city stretch its arms across the skyline. She opened her laptop. The cursor blinked, expectant. She began to write again. Not about pain. Not about erasure. But about a woman standing at the edge of something unknown, with ink on her fingers and a story no one could steal. Not anymore. Paper Skin was just the beginning. Now they'd read everything she'd been too afraid to say. And this time, her name would be on the cover. The world only listens when it thinks it knows who is speaking. But truth doesn't need permission to exist. Ruth Marwood taught us that dignity isn't always loud, and brilliance doesn't ask for validation. It writes itself, patiently, until someone finally sees. Or doesn't. Either way, it shines. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and stay with you.